Well, thank you everybody for showing up today. First of all, how are we all liking the gun show? We all having a good time this weekend?
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. Let's, before we start, let's give Rich a big round of applause. He's the one who's been putting this thing together. I don't even know if this thing would have happened without Rich, so we're all really glad he's here. So what we're going to talk about today is kind of first aid that gun owners should know. And so it's not going to be so much of how to apply like certain dressings and stuff, because that's like a whole different type of class and a different venue. But as gun owners, much to Rich's point, you know, it's important to know how to plug holes as much as it is to kind of make holes, right? So typically any time that you have to pull out your firearm and use your firearm as kind of safety conscious people who are ready for just anything to go down, there's probably a really good chance that somebody's going to need some sort of medical care. And so I want to talk about the types of injuries and things that we would be expecting in these types of situations, maybe the type of equipment that you might want to have, and then maybe places to find some training. Because just like with shooting, medical skills are a perishable skill, and really it's all muscle memory. So a little bit about myself. Before I was this 2A activist and that kind of thing, I was an Army medic for 6 years. I served in Afghanistan from 2006 to 2007, where I was the medic for first a heavy weapons company and then a scout platoon on the Afghan-Pakistan border. And then after that, I was a senior medic for an artillery battery in Iraq. And that job was really different because I actually worked with the State Department a little bit, and I put together a course that I taught to the Kurdish Peshmerga. So the Kurdish Peshmerga is this kind of group of ethnic fighters. They were integrating into the Iraqi army, and I was teaching them a combat first aid course and putting that together. So one of the things that I really want you all to take away from this, if nothing else, right, other than that dude has a really sick mustache, is first aid is part of the 2A lifestyle, right? So it's really easy to get caught up on, having the right firearm and the right holster and all this stuff, but it's equally important to help people in need. So if we think about why do we carry firearms, why do we buy firearms, why do we have them under our beds and in our closets and wherever it is you guys are keeping them, it's because we're ready for something crazy to go down, right? And so it is more likely that you will come across a medical emergency than a need to use your firearm. And so that's what we want to start thinking about. Also, as I continue on, before I forget, what I also want to ask you guys is, I don't want to just sit here and talk at you either. So if you do have any questions, just interrupt me, right? You don't need to raise your hand. Nobody wants to sit here and be lectured and that kind of thing. Let's keep it an open conversation. There's no such thing as a bad or a dumb question unless you don't ask it. That's the only stupid question, is the one that goes unasked. So when we think about first aid and what we're doing, there's kind of really two big systems in your body that we want to be familiar with, right? And the first one is that respiratory system. That respiratory system is kind of comprised of two different segments. You have your upper respiratory system, which is kind of like your nasal or nose and oral pharyngeal airway, and it goes down into your kind of neck and into your lungs. And then you have that lower respiratory system, which is your lungs. And the whole point of that, right, when we kind of look at what it does, it's to get oxygen into your bloodstream, right? Your body needs oxygen to survive. And then it gets kind of carbon dioxide out of your blood. So once you use up all that oxygen, your body produces carbon, and we want to spit it out before we get poisoned or anything like that. The other thing we really want to think about is we have a circulatory system, and that's kind of what we all think about in a way, right, when we talk about first aid, is that circulatory system, that blood and that kind of stuff. And what the circulatory system does is it takes up that oxygen from your lungs and it circulates it or perfuses it through your arteries to all your vital organs, right? And it kind of permeates through to your capillaries and different parts. And I know I'm getting really boring and academic here, but basically it gets oxygen into your body. And then your veins take that used up oxygen and send it back, right? To get cleaned out, expel that carbon, and get more oxygen into your bloodstream. And so now that we kind of understand these two kinds of systems, we can then start talking about bleeding. But before I get into that, I want to pause for a moment and just see what questions we might have so far. Okay, everyone's good? It's too dark, so I can't see if your eyes are glossed over yet. So when we have bleeding, there's really like 3 types of bleeding that we want to think about. The first one's capillary. That's when you're chopping an onion, right, in the kitchen. You nick the top of your finger and it won't stop bleeding and you're like doing this over your head for like, seems like forever, right? That's probably the least serious type of bleeding. That's probably not going to kill you, right? Then you have venous blood, right? And a venous bleed is kind of this kind of gradual flow. And it's really dark red and it looks almost kind of dirty, right? You're just, what is this stuff? And it's coming out. That's a pretty serious bleed if you don't treat it, depending on the nature of the injury. And then you have your arterial bleed. That is something that is pulsing out of your body, right? Or out of the wound, kind of at the rate of your heart. And it's bright red and it's probably really scary because there's blood everywhere, right? And that's probably the most serious type of bleed that you'll have. And actually an arterial bleed will kill you in under 5 minutes, depending on how bad that is. So when we think about first aid, you know, who here has taken a first aid class before? Right? Back in the day, you remember they're like airway bleeding control, right? Heck no, you take care of that blood first, right? Because it's going to take you about 10 to 12 minutes to die from a lack of oxygen. It's going to take you less than 5 to die from an arterial bleed. So let's go ahead and get that squared away. And then your venous bleed, that's a little bit less serious, but that's also, depending on how bad that injury is, that's also going to be a bad day for you too. Because if we think about the veins, it's sending that used up blood to be cleaned out, and it's not going back into your system to put oxygen throughout your body.
Quick question.
Yes, sir.
Arterial is away from the heart, and
yes.
venous is back to the heart.
Absolutely. That is the perfect way to think about it. And the arteries actually, interesting point, that's actually kind of how you can tell if things are kind of moving smoothly. So if we think about it, we have our carotid artery, and then we have like our brachials on our arms, and then on our wrists, and then on our thighs, and behind our knees, and on top of our feet. And these are, you know, the pulses that tell you everything is working well or not, right? So if you want to check like the bilateral pulses, right, on the wrists, and they're both the same pace and the same kind of strength, that means everything's probably pretty honky-dory, right? But then if they're kind of different, and maybe you have one pulse that's super weak and the other one is real strong, that's probably, there's probably a breakdown in the system, right? It's no different than a mechanic looking at a car, right? You see maybe fluids aren't pumping to the right part of the engine, right? Or you see stuff leaking. You know, these are the things that can tell you if something's wrong before you even get to your patient and look at their injury, right? And that kind of helps you figure out what to do so you're not unnecessarily jostling them around. Same thing with breathing, right? If your patient's hooting and hollering and they're in pain, that tells you they have a secure airway and whatnot, right? So it's like, all right, this dude's breathing all right, even though he's telling me to hurry up. So, I don't know if we can see that, but there's kind of, as gun owners and members of the 2A community, there's a few types of injuries that are probably going to be the most common that we're going to want to train for and prepare for and be cognizant of. And so the first one, that's the penetrating wounds. That's what we all think about with firearms. That's like the gunshot, that's the stabbing, that's the impalement, right? We also have airway obstructions where your patient isn't able to breathe, which means they can't get oxygen into their blood and into their organs, into their brain. We also have burns. We're going to see burns whether we're out there training, or I see some of those YouTube videos, people are out there shooting tannerite or propane tanks and stuff and doing all that wild stuff. Don't do that, by the way. But it happens and people get burned. And then we also have weather injuries, and that's probably going to be the most common as gun owners, right? Because it's San Diego, it gets hot, especially in East County. We're out in the desert, we're shooting guns, having a good time. Maybe you're a hunter, right? And it's getting real cold, or it's real hot or something like that. So the first thing we want to think about is those penetrating wounds, those common penetrating wounds. We have gunshots, stabbing, and impalements. Gunshots are kind of tricky, right? Because you would think there's a few things to consider with those. First of all, you have cavitation from that bullet, and that cavitation means all the space behind that bullet as it's traveling is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And one of the things that we had to consider when I was in the military is tumbling or fragmentation. So if you're using what's called frangible ammunition, like those green tipped 5.56s, right? Those are really great if you're the one shooting them, not so much if you're the receiver. And the problem is when they fragment apart, they can start nicking arteries or kinds of other parts of organs and things like that. And then you can have kind of these hidden injuries that might not be able to give you an honest assessment of that particular patient. The other thing we want to think about are stabbings. That's something else that probably more in the world we're living in, right? Where we're just going about, you're a concealed carry holder, you're taking the train or the bus or whatever, and you got some crazy person out there and they stab you. That's a pretty honest injury. It's in, it's out, there's probably blood. So long as they don't get an artery or a vital organ like in your chest or in your lower abdomen or something like that, you'll probably be okay if you apply some pressure. And then there's impalements, right? That's where you have that kind of fixed object, and that can come from anything, right? You fall, something gets lodged at you, you're messing with a stingray. And you know, that's one of those types of injuries that really require a lot of discipline as well, because you have your patient freaking out, something's sticking out of you, right? And you're like, holy crap. And your natural instinct is to get it out of there, but that hole that that impaled object made is actually keeping it plugged as well, right? And the minute you pull it out, you're gonna have a whole bunch of problems. So the best thing to do is kind of bandage that thing in place, right? And make sure you're not jostling around your patient so much so we can get them to the care that they need, to that next echelon of care. I'm gonna pause for a second, mostly for oxygen, but also to see what questions we have so far about penetrating wounds or anything we've talked about so far. All right.
So
Yes, sir.
on an impalement,
Yeah.
things are like, you know, gushing out. Would you recommend something like a quick clot?
You could, absolutely. The thing with quick clot, depending on its form, right? Because sometimes it's in that powdery form. I think it was just.
It attacks everything that's wet. So
Yeah, everything that's wet, or if it's really windy, it's really hard to get into the wound. If you have it and you can kind of control getting it in there, absolutely, that's a fantastic intervention. Other things you can get, like it's called combat gauze, which basically has quick clot in it, and you can pack that gauze with the quick clot in the wound. It can also help stabilize the impalement if it's a little bit loose in there. It also starts coagulating the blood, and then also with the cool thing with gauze is when it's in a wound, it creates pressure internally as it soaks up any blood, right? Which is really good for applying pressure on that wound. But you can absolutely, you can use that quick clot if you got it.
So in conjunction with that question, so there is the impalement. You use the quick clot, and it's on like a venous or a what's the other one?
Arterial?
Arterial wound. Like, what would be the potential damage if it was to accidentally like clog up that artery vein?
Well, if it's an arterial wound, you probably wouldn't use quick clot. You would use a tourniquet because it's on a limb, right? And then unless it's on your neck, don't put a tourniquet on your neck. But you know what I mean? You want to apply pressure and that kind of thing, and maybe you can use a little bit of quick clot with some training. Don't really recommend it though. So typically with an arterial bleed, that's not something you're going to use, because if you think about it, a properly applied tourniquet shuts the artery off, right? Right. And so when we think about, well, is it going to stop an artery or a vein? Well, that's kind of the point, right, of the intervention. What we want to do is make sure whatever is about to kill that patient within 5 to 10 minutes or however long it takes to get them into an ER, we stop it. That is all we care about. That is all we care about. Like, stop that patient from dying or losing a limb or eyesight, life, limb, or eyesight, right, before they get to a hospital. What can we do to keep them alive? And that's the cool thing. None of it's rocket science. I barely graduated high school and I was a teenager, and they taught me how to do this stuff because it really is that simple, right? The next thing we want to think about though is airway obstructions or common airway injuries. So a lot of times that's obstruction. Somebody's choking, right? Like, they're eating a little bit too fast, they're hungry. Other things are anaphylactic shock, right? So basically you're having an allergic reaction. This is another one of those types of injuries that as gun owners we might come across because you're out in the woods, somebody got into something, they had an allergy you didn't know about. And this also requires a lot of discipline as well, because that airway is closing up, right? They're going into that anaphylactic shock. And so they're gonna be thirsty, they want water. Like, nah, dude, you can't have it. Even if you don't think it's that bad, you're not dying of dehydration before you die from a lack of oxygen. So we wanna keep that airway secure as much as possible until we get them that kind of epinephrine or whatever that medicine they need. And then very specifically in the gun community, we wanna think about something called a tension pneumothorax. That's really just me trying to sound smart, and it's really chest air, right? So you have your thoracic cavity or chest. Basically, air is filling up, a lung collapse. A lot of time, the most common kind of mechanism of this type of injury is a gunshot, right? You have a penetrating wound or a stab, right? And that air is filling up in your chest cavity, and it's eventually creating pressure, right? If it's not escaping, which crushes the heart, and it pushes and crushes the heart. So some of the kind of later types of stages of this type of injury, you'll see like the tracheal deviation, the throat's moving to the side. You'll see the jugular vein popping out. They call that jugular distension, right? And that means you need to relieve that pressure. So if you have like a chest seal, which can be done very simply, all you really need is plastic and tape, to be honest. Those like cool guy chest seals, those occlusive dressings, half of them don't work if the wound is wet or dirty or anything, which is pretty much every gunshot wound to the chest, right? So you know, you go ahead and just burp it. You kind of release the seal so the air comes out. If there is no hole, then you might have to do what's called a needle decompression, and I'd recommend getting some training for that. So that's kind of an interesting thing, right? How do you get a collapsed lung if you haven't been shot or stabbed? So you can actually get a collapsed lung from what's called blunt force trauma, car accident, right? That steering wheel hits you. Somebody hits you with a baseball bat, that can happen. Believe it or not, runners will get them too. So like a skinny runner dude, you're like, hey, this guy's really fit. They're putting their respiratory system under a lot of stress from that activity, and sometimes the lung just collapses or a hole bursts, right? And that's something to think about as well. So remember, you know, if somebody's like, hey, it really hurts on this side, it's getting hard to breathe, it hurts when I breathe in, that's that tension pneumothorax coming in real quick. And then next we have burns. This is something we're actually going to see quite a bit of, at least hopefully just at a low level, if even at all, when we're out at the range, right? And so like you got your first degree burns, that's the sunburn, right? It's guys, you need to wear sunscreen, I'm sorry, and you got to reapply. I'm terrible about it too. Wear long sleeves, throw some aloe vera on it, you're good to go. Some of the more serious ones though are like second degree burns where you have blistering, right? And that's where you want to kind of loosely wrap that wound, maybe with some cool, not cold water. Never use something super cold on a burn that shocks your body, that exacerbates the injury. And then basically the goal of that though is when you do have a burn, it's still cooking, right? So we want it to stop from cooking. That's why we want to cool it down a little bit. Some first aid kits come with burn cream. A lot of times those will trap heat into the wound. I'm not a fan, but there's also like a silver cream. That's typically not something you're going to keep in a first aid kit. And then of course you also have your third degree burns, also known as full thickness. That's like complete tissue damage, nerve damage. A lot of times that victim isn't even going to feel it at that point because the nerves are damaged. That pain's going to come when they're healing in the hospital. When I was doing my clinicals in medic school, I was actually on a burn ward for my clinicals, and we had this guy, his Bradley hit an IED, right? And you know, he suffered third degree burns, and he was in total pain, right? Because those nerve endings were growing back as his body was healing himself. So whenever we change dressings or even give him a shave, right? You get the morphine lollipop and go to town, it still hurts, but that's usually where that pain kind of comes. How are we doing so far? I know I'm going pretty fast here. We have any questions? Yes, sir. Let's go for it.
Clear back to the gunshot wound.
Yeah, yeah.
You don't have to go back the slide. Around hits the body, abdomen, clears the body, goes all the way through.
Yeah.
Which entrance or exit wound do you go after first?
Both, really. Yeah. I mean, you want to patch them both. Typically, when that patient presents themselves, they're kind of on their back or on their chest, right? So, you know, typically, you know, you're going to want to, hey, let's treat both. And you're basically, there's two things you're probably going to want to do, and this is what you'll learn in these classes, is first you want to get a seal on that. So you're going to basically apply pressure with the back of your hand as you're getting out that chest seal, or you're just unwrapping a bandage to get that plastic. And then once you're done, you put the plastic down and then tape it off. And then you treat what you can. If there's anything else that's life-threatening on that side of the patient, take care of it real quick, and then you flip them over, or her, and then you go do the same thing, right? But we want to take care of everything all at once before we're flipping them over, because we don't want to unnecessarily move that patient.
Anaphylactic shock.
Yes.
Is there anything short of an EpiPen that we can carry with us to prevent that if someone else? Not
really. And to be completely honest, if you have allergies, you should be carrying an EpiPen, right? That is just, come on guys. Yeah, carry that EpiPen, and you know, let people know that you have it, right? So if you have an allergy, right, or an EpiPen or some sort of kind of condition, no shame in it, let people know. So it's like, you know, Russ over here, if he's allergic to bees, he's gonna say, hey, we're going out on a hike. By the way, I'm allergic to bee stings. My EpiPen is right here. If I start, you know, having trouble, just go ahead, right in the thigh, you know, or right in the butt cheek.
So nothing that we can take along in case somebody forgets theirs.
Yep.
Yeah, I was wondering about what's that stuff they use if someone has a drug overdose?
Narcan.
Yeah, Narcan.
Yeah, Narcan. That's something I think they just give out at schools now. No, that's a poor joke. So I carried Narcan as a medic. Typically, you know, if you have morphine or some sort of kind of medication like that, right? You always want to carry Narcan because if your patient has an adverse reaction, you immediately want to put that stuff in there. And as soon as it hits their veins,
And what is Narcan doing? Like what?
It's just canceling out the effects of you know, morphine or those types of drugs. Right?
It only lasts a short time though, right?
It can. It depends. Everything depends on the amount of medication that you're trying to counteract, right? So that all depends. Yes, ma'am.
Hopefully this would never happen, but how would you treat a gunshot wound that didn't go through? Let's say, and like you said, you know, it can get bigger, you don't know how big, and say it was the end of the world and no help was coming. Like, would you like irrigate it, flush it, like? How would you
Yeah.
do that?
So you're on the side of a mountain and you can't get a Casevac or a Medevac out for God knows how long, right? It's the end of the world. So what you're going to do, if it's still in the body, right, you're going to pack, same way pretty much you would treat it anyway. You'd pack that wound full of gauze if you need to, try and keep it clean, and then put a bandage on top of that until you can hopefully get to a place where, you know, you can give that patient better assistance, right?
Sooner or later, somebody's going to have to go take that bullet out.
Yeah, eventually. But not us. Unless anybody here is a trauma surgeon, that's not us. Our job, literally, if you're like a first responder, you're doing first aid. Yeah.
Eventually, you're going to have to get that person to
Exactly.
treatment, you know.
Exactly. We just want to stop anything that's going to kill that person in like 5 to 10 minutes. And then that buys us a little bit of time. But that's a really good question, right? Like, what do you do in that situation? And then you just kind of have to manage that patient, especially if the bullet's still in there. Or even if it went through, you also want to keep an eye around like the areas around the wound as well to make sure we didn't get any bit of that like tumbling or fragmentation that might have caused any follow-on injuries. Good question. Sir in the back.
You were talking about the second degree burns and
Yep.
stopping the cook.
Yep.
Does more commonly accessible items in a household like aloe?
Aloe?
And does that have any benefit in stopping the cook?
Yeah, aloe's fine. Honey. Honey.
Not butter.
Don't do butter.
Actually, honey's good for a lot of things.
Honey's also a good disinfectant as well.
No ice?
Sorry?
You don't put
No
it-
ice. Ice is too cold. That will shock the body. Yep.
Copy that.
Yeah, we don't want to shock the body. Yes, sir.
Okay, when I was doing Boy Scout training, they're always saying how one of the biggest things to be, you know, people don't die from the injuries, right? They always die from the shock.
Yep.
Nobody talks about shock much anymore. Is
Yeah.
it discounted or is
No, it's not cool. That's what, no. So with shock, anytime you have a patient that is, you know, something traumatic has happened, whether they're losing blood or they're just worked up, right? You can go into shock, and you do want to keep that patient warm unless they start sweating, of course, and that tells you they're fine. But yeah, individually, right? When we think of like an immediate intervention for a wound, we're trying to secure the airway and stop the bleeding. Now, when it comes to management, right? Maybe it's about 10 minutes until that ambulance comes. Yeah, then you're going to kind of put their feet up. You want to put a blanket or a hoodie or something on there to keep them warm as part of that kind of patient management.
Okay, so it still exists. It's just not.
Oh, absolutely.
Not immediate.
It's not immediate, right? But it's also something you don't want to discount either.
Okay.
Yep. So the other kind of injury that we then have is we also have kind of, we have these weather injuries. And to me, I mean, they're not 100% preventable, but in my view, they are the most preventable, right? And that comes from really paying attention to what you're doing, dressing appropriately, staying hydrated, that kind of stuff. And you can have anywhere from like heat rash to heat stroke or hypothermia and frostbite, probably more the heat injuries here in San Diego, unless you're up in Julian or something in the winter. But the thing with these, right, is if you stay hydrated, you're dressed appropriately, you're wearing sunscreen and all that kind of stuff, and you're also maintaining your electrolytes, right? You're drinking that electrolyte drink, or you're having, you know, food and that kind of stuff, salt. That's going to keep the water in your body. That's what's really going to help you mitigate these heat injuries. Go to shade if you're not feeling good, right? That's another thing. People, you're out there shooting. Let's be honest, 2A people sometimes are a little bit too tough for our own good. If you're not feeling good, get under the shade. Get that wet towel on your neck or something and just chill out for a little bit. Because once you become a weather casualty, you are more susceptible to becoming a weather casualty in the future, whether it's heat or cold. So once it happens the first time, it's easier the next time. So my wife, she got pneumonia when she was in college. We're always worried about the cold, right? When I was a medic, I knew every single person in my platoon or element, like their medical history, right? And I would know, hey, that guy over there, he's a heat casualty. That guy, heat casualty in basic training, right? Heat casualty last year, we were at the National Training Center, you know what I mean? And that's all stuff you gotta pay attention to, and you gotta recognize those symptoms and be honest with yourself. There's no shame in it, right? Don't be tough. You know, sometimes all you gotta do is sit down in some shade, cool off a little bit, then you can get out there and go have some fun. So we kind of have we had a nice little overview, right, as much as you can in an environment like this, of the types of injuries that, you know, we're likely to see as gun owners, as part of the 2A community. We have those penetrating wounds, those airway obstructions, we have burns, and then we also have those weather injuries. And the other thing that we all love to think about is the gear. What kind of stuff do we have, right? And so there's kind of two things we want to think about. We have individual first aid kits, like an IFAK is what it's called for short, and aid bags. That IFAK needs to be on you, right? If you're training, like you're at the range or you're doing some cool guy stuff, you're out hunting, whatever, keep that IFAK on you. And really the purpose of that first aid kit is somebody uses that on you. That is for you if you're hurt. And then if you have some additional training and some supplies, then you're gonna wanna keep that larger kind of bag, that aid bag specifically, like in your car or in a central location at your base camp, or, you know, by the range tower or wherever it is that you are. When you are training, by the way, you want to make sure that everybody you're training with, you all know where each other's IFAK is, right? So if you're out at doing those combat pistol courses or carbine courses, and the beautiful thing about that is you should all have your IFAK in the same place, so we don't have to remember everybody's little ism. And the cool thing is if you get something like this where you have these MOLLE straps, it's really easy, or those Alice clips or whatever it is we're using these days, you can kind of move them around as needed. So that way everybody knows if somebody goes down, IFAK's on the right side, use that, right? And then you should predominantly be using those types of things. When it comes to aid kits, they kind of come in all shapes and sizes. And what I really want you to understand is you don't have to break the bank to have these. I think one of the biggest traps, and I'll be honest, man, this gets me all the time too, right? In the 2A community, we get sucked into that gear trap, right? You're watching those like videos on YouTube or those cool guy Instagrams or whatever, and they're like, you got to get this Haley Strategic or whatever, and you look at us like $200 and you're like, holy smokes. You don't need to do all that. Really, go to, like, this is San Diego. You can't even throw a stone without hitting a surplus store, you know what I mean? Go ahead and you can get something like these little pouches, right? And go make a first aid kit with that, right? You can go ahead and get some gauze at CVS, some ACE wraps, right? Some surgical tape, do whatever, right? Just stick it in there, put it on your gear. You don't have to break the bank. Some of the stuff we see right here, right? We have some of these pouches and just some trauma shears and a cat tourniquet, right? If you do go get some, you know, supplies from a medical distributor, like North American Rescue is always really, really good. If you see something that's really cheap, right, do your research. We don't want to maybe put our life in the hands of that equipment, but if it's really cheap, buy it and practice with it. Just like with your firearms, you're practicing dry firing, right, in your garage. You're going to the range all the time. Practice those tourniquets. You know if it's good if you can't feel your pulse. We used to do that when I was in the Army all the time. We practice tourniquets on each other. Practice your different pressure dressings. You can do lots of really cool pressure dressings with just some gauze and an ACE wrap, actually, right? And in some ways, it's a lot more versatile than, say, one of those cool Israeli dressings you get. Those are pretty sweet, though. This is what I have right now. That's my medic bag that I take with me when I go to the range. But on my pistol belt right here, I just have a good old-fashioned IFAK, right in the back on my right side. That's usually where most people have it. Even though I'm a lefty shooter, I still keep it there because that's what everybody's used to, right? And so that's what we're working with. But you'll also see right here, I think this is in Iraq, I have all sorts of pouches here, right, with all sorts of stuff. I mean, you know, I think one was like extra airway stuff and extra like hemorrhaging stuff. One thing to keep in mind, what I see a lot of people doing with their gear, I would never tell somebody how to wear their gear, right? But try not to keep, if you can avoid it, your IFAK on the front, right? Because that's where most of the bullets are going. If in case you're ever wearing that stuff in real life, you want to have it hidden somewhere. Whew. All right, so I just went through a lot in a really short period of time. How are we doing so far?
Quick contents in your IFAK pack, sorry.
Yeah. What's up?
Contents in your IFAK pack. What do you got in there?
Inventory.
I've got gauze. I've got cat tourniquet. I've got an Israeli dressing. I've got surgical tape, trauma shears, an ACE wrap. Even though it didn't come with it, I just added it in there. And I have some combat gauze and an oral pharyngeal airway, so a nasal trumpet.
Okay.
Yep. I should. I don't think I have one right now because I think it's in my aid bag. So that is a reminder for when I get home. Yes, Russ.
We picked up a couple of pretty good value ones from Costco.
Yep.
The only thing that I would add to what came in was a bed wrap.
Sorry?
Bed wrap. You know,
Okay.
that, you know, stuff that adheres so well.
Oh, yeah.
Unlike the ACE bandage, you have to hook something.
Yep.
Bed wrap self-adheres.
Yep. Absolutely. That's great stuff.
Yeah, I learned about it from the, horses.
Oh yeah, absolutely. A lot of the stuff you can get really isn't that expensive, right? I think trauma shears are $7. Get a good pair of those because you want to expose that wound when you're working on it. Make sure you have some good quality cat tourniquets. Those are those combat application tourniquets or whatever it is that stands for. I can never remember. Those are probably the things you want to make sure you get. If you are going to spend some money, that's what you're going to want to spend it on because those are the things that will stop something immediately. And then just gauze, ACE wraps, and really just tape, right? And then a Sharpie, because if you are using a tourniquet, you want to place the time that you placed it on their forehead. And keep in mind, you can go up to about 6 to 8 hours and still keep that limb if you have a tourniquet, right? So that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to lose that limb.
What about rubber gloves for yourself?
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely, you want to keep rubber gloves.
Natural.
Are you a CCW carrier?
I am.
Then what do you carry with you as far as first aid equipment?
I usually keep it in the car.
Okay.
So one of the things I was talking about earlier is a lot of that stuff is bulky.
Yeah.
And the last thing I want to do, especially in California, is I don't want to draw any attention to myself. I don't want to print on anything. A lot of times too, I also have a backpack. You could throw something in a backpack if you need to, but usually I keep my first aid stuff in the car. Yep. Good questions. Cool. So one of the last things I want to talk about before I just open up to general conversation in general is, we're talking about the things we want to think about as gun owners, the types of injuries we want to be prepared for, but by no means are we sitting here and like, this is how you do this type of intervention. It's because you need to get training, just like you do with your firearms, just like you do with anything else. You want to get training and you want to continually renew that training. One really good resource is the California Emergency Medical Services Authority. If you go to their website, they will have a list of approved, medical training programs for TCC or tactical combat care. Those are really great. That's the kind of stuff you can find something locally. The American Red Cross, fantastic. Go get CPR certified. It takes a day. The cool thing about getting CPR certified or when you're doing your renewal is there's going to be other medical professionals there because everybody has to get a CPR certification, right? And so that's a really great way to talk to like nurses and firefighters or peace officers or anybody in this type of environment to learn about other types of training in the area as well. And American Red Cross also has more advanced training like advanced life support and stuff like that. And then also your local community college. So let's say you did your CPR course and maybe you took a class on some TCC or something. You're like, this is awesome, I want to be a paramedic, right? You should absolutely do that. Your community college actually has these courses, right? And you get that intuition rate. And you can go ahead and take these classes and they'll get you on ambulance ride-alongs and all sorts of good stuff. Highly recommend it. Also something if you just have maybe a little bit of time, take like a class every semester or something. Yes, sir.
I actually took the first responder course at a community college, and it was pretty comprehensive.
Yep.
I would say.
Where'd you take it?
Walla Walla Community College in Walla Walla, Washington.
Oh, okay, so not local.
Not
But if you guys are in Walla Walla, go check it out. Yes, sir.
A local place that I highly recommend in Kearney Mesa is Strategic Operations.
Yep.
They have some hyper-realistic scenarios that they run. They do the training. They run you through some very hyper-realistic. They have actors that have amputations.
Yep.
That will put on prosthetics, and they have fake blood squirting all over the place.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
What was that called again?
Strategic Operations.
That's fantastic. And yeah, we did a lot of that stuff when I was in the military. We also had what were called sim men, which were these like robots that would like breathe and also bleed as well. And then we would also do like goat labs and that kind of stuff. But as far as like locally, there's a lot of really good stuff right out there. And there's a lot of really great classes you can take. And for as much effort as you put into training with your firearm, right? Put that same effort into training for first aid, because let me knock on wood, right? But if there's something around, it is a lot more likely you will need to give somebody first aid or emergency medical care than you will need to use your firearm. Now, I'm not saying discard that, right? I'm a gun owner myself, but also at the same time, that is what you're going to need. And there's nothing worse than having to sit there and watch somebody who needs help if you can't help them. All right, so last talk of the symposium. Last of the day. You guys made it. So just to kind of summarize, and I want to open it up for questions in general. I know Rich has some cool stuff we can hand out. As gun owners, when you think about carrying your firearm, purchasing a firearm, having a firearm, you should think about that in parallel with first aid, right? It is not just about gun ownership. It is half of the equation, right? Because we have these firearms because we are prepared for bad things to happen. And we want to be prepared for not just one kind of bad things. You can't shoot, matter of fact, you don't want to shoot somebody who needs help, right? You can't shoot your way out of every problem. And so we want to train with first aid. And the things that we are going to be thinking about and that we want to see, and maybe you might want to look up on YouTube later before you start looking up some courses. We have penetrating wounds, airway compromise, burns, and weather injuries. These are really simple types of injuries to give immediate first aid to. You don't need a lot of stuff. You don't need a full-on like ambulance with you to give people immediate care before you get them to the paramedics or get them to the hospital. And it's something you can easily be prepared for. So with that said, I'd love to open it up and see what other questions we might have so far. Yes, sir.
Did you have any Christian Science medics in the service?
No, it was pretty standardized how we the types of interventions we were allowed to use.
Oh, okay.
Yes, sir.
I don't really have a question. I was just like, I think that there should be more classes like that, because whenever I go out and I purchase a firearm or a new firearm, I think of it like I go out and I buy a car.
Yeah.
There's going to be things that you can take care of and that you need to be able to make sure that you can actually afford. You can't go out and buy a brand new sports car if you can't afford the tires and the oil change.
Absolutely.
Because if there's going to be more immediate things that you're going to need a mechanic for, and that would be like, i.e. the hospital. So if you go out and you have a firearm, there are things that you need to be just in case of somebody in the house accidentally gets a hold of it and does something stupid by accident, shoots it off to the roof. Can I take care of this issue? And then what are the next steps? I think there should be more classes like that where
absolutely.
First
Brilliantly put. Absolutely.
They wanted, the instructors were like, I wish everybody in this town was trained this way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something they ought to teach like in a high school curriculum.
Yeah. Absolutely. Somebody email Tony Thurman, right? He's the head of education for the state. No, I kid. But yeah, absolutely, right? Like this is something that it is critical, right? This is just like a critical life skill. And arguably, and I'm in mixed company to say this, it might even be more important than firearms ownership, right? Like, I mean, nothing's more important. God, come on now, Second Amendment. But, in all reality, like, these are the problems we're going to see more likely. Especially look at what's happening in our communities. We are overwhelmed with, an epidemic of substance abuse, of behavioral health, And then when you have people who, and then homelessness, and when you have people who are living on the streets for whatever reason, it's not a comment on them specifically, but they're probably not getting the care and the treatment that they might need for other things. And there's a very real possibility, as you're going about your daily life, something is going to happen to where you will need to take care of somebody. Because if you're the person there and you're the person who sees it, it is now your responsibility. It's the human thing to do, right? And then you go get on your cell phone, you call the ambulance while you're trying to help that person out. Sweet.
I have another question.
Yeah.
Theoretical.
Sure.
Somebody's assaulting me, trying to kill me, trying to rob me, trying to rape me, whatever. And I've shot them. Am I expected to give first aid?
So that's a legal question, and I'm going to dance around this as best I can. But if you use lethal force, it is my understanding you are not obligated to help that person because you reasonably fear for your safety, which is presumably why you shot them. And there are cases that I learned about in my CCW class, took it with Bill Deasy, if anybody wants to shout out, where they're talking about somebody tried to help somebody who they just shot, and that person like grabbed a knife and that they had in their pocket and stabbed him and killed him, right? That's a pretty crazy scenario. I think that is an ethical question for you specifically. And it really depends on the scenario, right? There's never, especially in these types of situations, there's never like, this is what you do every single time. You have to assess, first of all, your safety and the people that you care first. That's presumably why you employed the use of that firearm. Me, having been a medic, like it's just not in me, I don't think, to just sit there and watch somebody die if I can help it, right? Like I don't want to shoot anybody. Like if I had to shoot somebody, that's 100% your fault, right? You're the one who forced me to do that because I'm gonna do everything I can to get out of that situation, even try and run away if I can. But also at the same time, your safety comes first, and they kind of put themselves in that position. That's how I feel. So, did we have any other questions?